As we know, on August 6th, Ukrainian forces launched an over-border attack into Russia in the Kursk region. Roughly 2 weeks have now passed, and the initial results of that incursion are favoring Ukraine, though long-term results remain to be seen. But some benefits and some costs of the attack have been known. Those will impact any future Ukrainian plans. This attack into Russia was initially largely successful. Does it all suggest it may make sense for Ukraine to do more of these kinds of incursions? This video will explore what the goals of the operation were, how successful each of the goals was, and finally give you, the viewer, context so you can know if similar future Ukrainian attacks may be in the cards. What's known so far is that Ukraine used battalions or more worth of units from each of 8 different brigades. Some of those are among the best and most battle-hardened units that Ukraine has. Those troops, when combined, numbered roughly 3 brigades worth, or likely over 10,000 men, assuming some support elements have remained inside Ukraine. Those units took quite a big chunk of Russian territory. Now, that many troops can be regarded as a big effort. Ukraine recently operated some 110 brigades in total, defending the country. Though as fresh troops come in, a few more brigades might be forming. Was then using 3 or more brigades worth of troops to attack Russia worthwhile? It was actually even more, because there were likely other reinforcement units just behind the border inside Ukraine. Plausibly other elements of those brigades ready to relieve the attacking companies, rotating in fresh companies. If that's so, there might easily have been 6 or more brigades worth of units dedicated for this incursion into Russia, even if not all were inside Russia at all times. Indeed, various bloggers who follow day-to-day activities on the front have been mentioning companies from several different brigades doing business in Russia. It doesn't necessarily mean all elements of those units being near the area, and some reports mentioning certain units might have been outright wrong. Various Ukrainian units were there across the border and likely spotted by Russia for months, but there was no reaction for months. Last-minute switches in Ukrainian unit composition may have been spotted, but plausibly not identified by Russia. Russia certainly did not expect Ukraine would actually use those units and go over the border. It's possible Russia actually removed some of the Belgorod and Kursk units in May and June, transferring them to aid around Kharkiv. Anyway, what has Ukraine achieved? Russian land was attacked, the first time this much territory was taken since World War II. Several hundred square kilometers were taken at one point, before Russian defense lines firmed up. That's a few times more than the Russian attack near Kharkiv took, back in May, though also a few times less than what Ukraine's offensive east of Kharkiv took back in September 2022. Goals of the whole operation have been fairly obvious, and days into the attack even various officials have started talking about those. As per Andriy Zagoranyuk, former Ukrainian defense minister who is now serving as government advisor, goals were to divert Russian troops fighting in other parts of Ukraine, to bring the war home to Russian citizens, discouraging them from supporting the war effort, to strengthen Kiev's position in future negotiations with Moscow, to expose Russian weakness and seize initiative, after a long period of unsuccessful offensives and losing ground to Russia elsewhere. Unnamed US officials, according to CNN, also corroborated many of those goals, explaining Russian forces were to be disrupted and demoralized. Additional inferred goals can be surmised: to raise morale in Ukrainian ranks by giving Ukrainian people and troops a high-profile successful attack into Russia, to slow down Russian gains elsewhere, and to show the donor governments of the West that Ukraine is still capable of harming Russia, thus possibly gaining further support and additional aid. Now, not all those goals have actually been achieved to the fullest. Let's go over each one. The first one is by far the biggest: to divert Russian troops fighting in other parts of Ukraine. That has been achieved in part. At least 2 battalions worth of units from the Kharkiv region have been rumored to have been diverted, which might cause issues for the Russian incursion north of Kharkiv in the days and weeks ahead. Also, a unit of experienced FPV drone operators from the Zaporizhia region was allegedly urgently relocated 2 more battalions from Zaporizhia direction have also allegedly been sent, as well as a Kherson battalion. Those may not be as significant as that southern part of the front line has been fairly dormant for quite some time. A naval infantry brigade that was used in Ukraine quite a lot also had a battalion sent. That may be another unit directly impacting operations in the east of Ukraine. Some units from the Leningrad and Moscow districts have also allegedly been sent. Those may have not been as directly involved in the fights in the east. But again, mostly battalion-sized elements were sent. Unlike Ukraine, which seems to have remaining battalions close by in Sumy to rotate and relieve the units inside Russia, Russian units may have been hastily assembled, sending whatever bits and pieces were available without as much support. In total, allegedly up to 11 battalions worth, that's almost 4 brigades worth of troops. That's in addition to local units such as Federal Security Service and National Guard units. The lack of several coherent large units meant Russia could not assemble a proper counterattack. Instead, the ragtag assembly of various battalions from all around seems to have been done to slow down or stop Ukrainians, not to actually counterattack. So what is still possible to come in the future is that Russia will indeed be redirecting more of the larger, more experienced units to the area. Even if those are not sent from east of Ukraine, they still might have been destined to go there, had it not been for this Ukrainian offensive. So in a way, it's possible Ukraine messed with Russian long-term plans. Also long-term, it's plausible that from now on, Russia will be keeping more troops at its border with Ukraine. Russian Bryansk region near Belarus and Kursk region next to it were lightly manned for quite a long time. A total of 20,000 Russian troops were manning those two regions, and that's before some of those were allegedly relocated to aid in the Kharkiv fight. If Russia after this incursion decides to station 30 or 40,000 troops in both regions, that means 7 or 8 brigades keeping the border, thus 7 or 10 brigades fewer available to fight in eastern Ukraine. But realistically, it's too early to tell any of that. Before we jump to the next point, let's also say that the Russian Air Force was forced to redirect quite a few of its attacks. A Ukrainian security think tank alleges up to half of Russian guided glide bombs have in recent weeks been directed to Kursk and neighboring Ukrainian Sumy regions. Sumy was targeted as Ukrainian logistics bases for the Kursk incursion are likely present there. Many of those bombs might have been destined for eastern Ukraine, had there been no Ukrainian attack. Anyway, an inferred goal was to slow down Russian gains elsewhere on the front. Since the start of the year, Russia has been taking Ukrainian territory in the east little by little. Even after Avdiivka fell, gains were still noticeable and fairly steady. Since the start of the Ukrainian attack in Kursk region, further Russian advances can be observed. They are sort of average compared to previous gains. So it's too early to tell if Ukraine's Kursk attack managed to slow down Russian progress in eastern Ukraine. On to the next point. To bring the war home to Russians, discouraging them from supporting the war effort and to demoralize the Russian forces. It's too early to really know what morale effects this incursion will have. Indeed, the incursion itself isn't finished. When it comes to the general population, historically speaking, attacking one's country may not lead to a drop in support and morale, but quite the opposite. When the US was attacked in Pearl Harbor, that event and that US defeat galvanized the US population and support for war skyrocketed. Of course, different examples also exist. After the initial defeats, the majority of the French population chose not to support the war effort in World War II, despite the fact that the majority of their country and a large part of their military was still untouched. Given the fairly small territory taken so far and not many people affected by the attack, it could very well be that the number of Russians who will start supporting the war, those living far away from the region, will be greater than the number which will cease their support, like those who fled the area. Of course, none of that is counting millions of people already involved and invested in war. Perhaps many lost family members, and so on. Most of those have already decided which side to choose, and those kinds of operations won't really sway them one way or the other. Ukraine may be hoping the net morale in Russia will drop, but it's a gamble. When it comes to Ukrainian morale, it's almost assured that this kind of operation will lift the spirits and result in a net morale boost. questions remain, of course. How long will the morale boost last? If Ukraine holds onto the gains for weeks or months more, its morale effect might even grow a bit. And when Russia counterattacks properly, will Ukrainian troops readily retreat back into Ukraine? Will the Russian counterattack cause many casualties, perhaps on both sides? If Ukraine manages to lose many of its good troops during a Russian counterattack, then the net morale effect for Ukraine might even turn negative. As those US and Ukraine officials we mentioned said, the goal is not to hold the Russian territory for long. Sure, there were reports of Ukrainians building some fortifications inside Russia, but those can also serve to slow down Russian advance and provide Ukrainians with more time to retreat. It's plausible that Ukraine plans to remain inside Russia for as long as there's not too much threat to it. But that sort of conflicts with one other point of the operation, to strengthen the Ukrainian position in future negotiations with Moscow. When there comes a time when peace negotiations happen between Russia and Ukraine, there might indeed be occupied land changing hands. In theory, Ukraine could give back a piece of Russia that it was holding in exchange for something else. But for that to work, Ukraine would still have to be keeping on to some Russian soil at the moment of negotiations, which doesn't mesh with the claims in the media that Ukraine doesn't intend to stay long inside Russia. It could also be, however, that Ukraine thinks it will be able to repeat these kind of incursions successfully, even after they retreat from Kursk, that maybe another attack later on can take land that Ukraine can then trade in the future. Of course, the success of this first attack will likely shape any possible future attacks. If Ukraine retreats without many casualties, and if Russia doesn't keep the future border well manned and defended, then Ukraine might indeed repeat the incursion. The last point talks about exposing Russian weakness to show the Western donor governments that Ukraine is still capable of hitting back at Russia. That's again a point that's quite successful as of now. Unless Ukraine suffers grave casualties in a possible future Russian counterattack, it's likely this attack will result in greater political will to keep aiding Ukraine. So after all this, does it make sense for Ukraine to repeat such an attack? It really depends on the results of this first attack, and not all the results have come in yet. But this video listed the points to be mindful of. So when you're watching the news in the future, you may instinctively know what to look for and conclude for yourself if it makes sense for Ukraine to repeat this. While clearly successful, Ukraine may pay a certain price for this particular attack. It appears to have diverted some of its best units from east of Ukraine within just days. It could have used those experienced brigades to defend the eastern front line instead. Without the Kursk attack and with those brigades added, the Russian successes in the east might have moved slower. While one of big future wins might be if Russia is forced to keep substantial forces near Ukrainian borders, such a scenario might also mean that Ukraine too will have to dedicate more troops to those very same borders. Otherwise, it might risk Russian incursions all over the northern front. But for now, the attack is a resounding success, if for no other reason than because of a morale boost and a show of confidence in Ukraine's abilities. In a way, this Kursk region attack was using an opportunity that appeared. Number of units present notwithstanding, the northeastern border with Russia is nominally not a good part of the front to attack. It's close to Russian logistics points, close to a wide network of Russian air and army bases, and far away from Western aerial recon assets to help Ukraine with surveillance. But Russians were too confident they wouldn't get attacked. They were too careless to man the border properly, and they paid the price, despite other suboptimal conditions. Will it happen again? Remains to be seen. The final results of the first operation will certainly dictate other similar future attacks. And remember, Binkov may talk about war, but only real peace can bring us all together.